Let's see. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for giving me an opportunity to say a few words. My name is Chris Deschene. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. In our language, we would say which means in English, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. Here, I'd like to just spend some time on our effort. We ran voting, get out to vote, and a number of other activities during the last election during 2020 under a group called Battleground Indian Country. But I'm also here to talk about Native American voting in America. So if we look at this first slide, what we have is we have really kind of the indigenous map of tribes and where they were throughout the United States before the United States. And so we can see through geographically, we can see by the languages, we can see by the regions, the different major cultural groups as it related to early or what sometimes we call pre-contact. And in this regard, my tribe, as you can see in the Southwest, part of the Navajo, Apache, and the Pueblo regions of what would become the four corners of the United States. But as you can tell, all throughout, tribes were occupying every region that that we have here in the United States presently. This second slide talks about Indian country as it was diminished. So as settlers move westward, the tribes and native nations ceded vast territories to the United States in exchange for guarantees of much smaller but secure reservations. On those, for those agreements, they were captured under treaties, and those treaties were negotiated, especially with the early treaties. And if you look at the first map above, you see 1784 through 1819. A lot of the core treaties that were developed were during this time when the nation was very young. It was more or less negotiating on a nation-to-nation status with tribes as they were coming into contact, and therefore using the mechanism at that time, which were treaties. And so today, there are a lot of provisions in these treaties that tribes say, hey, we still have rights because we negotiated in exchange for giving up lands and giving lands to settlers, these rights that were preserved in the treaties. But the government, unfortunately, quickly reneged on its obligations. So you can see that by the westward progression through the time. So you have 1820s, you have 1840s, 1860s, the 1880s, and then present day. Also, during the 1800s, the United States enacted policies that supported wars, legislation, and through rulings from the Supreme Court that resulted in Native Americans losing ownership and control of 99% of their original homelands. Some of these laws, and especially with regards to the Supreme Court, were doctrines that were essentially made up. And one of them is called the plenary doctrine, plenary powers doctrine that the United States uses as it enacted tribal policies and basically tribal legislation. But even with all this control and oversight, tribes were still not members of the United States and were not citizens. So during at the turn of the 20th century, members were still not considered US citizens, and then were still not allowed to vote. So this talks about a little bit in more detail of federal Indian law and policies. There are major principles and errors that tribes endured during those progression, the migration of the United States. In the beginning, we had really this treaty era. You could, if I quickly go back, you can see during the 1800s up until about after the Civil War, the United States was negotiating with tribes in a treaty kind of relationship. After the about 1880s, the United States started moving to executive order tribes, which instead of negotiating on the legislative side, the president would then create reservations through executive order. So now you have executive order reservations. Starting in the 1900s, we started dealing with acquisitions in terms of land, mineral deposits. So if you see this lower right corner, you go from the 1860s to the 1880s through 1972, a diminishment in the lands due to land policies. So the General Allotment Act was one of the biggest laws that were put in place that diminished lands from Indian country. And so now you have the progression treaties to executive order to allotment era, now going into an era started actually during the 1930s after prohibition. There was a resurgence under FDR, and Congress legislated and created a bill called the Indian Reorganization Act. So they tried to say, look, we're going to try to address not only the land issues, but citizenship, the ability for tribes to engage in business through corporate laws. But what happened was the states still did not grant tribes really voting, even though they're recognized as citizens under the Indian Citizenship Act. I'll come back to it here. They were still implementing some of these policies. And so we had things like termination of tribes. There was hyper regulations. There was preventing access to ancestral lands and sacred sites and water. There was use of the Constitution principles like using federal preemption, authorization of state jurisdiction, the Commerce Clause. These types of doctrines are already within the Constitution to then create new principles like what they issued under plenary power, domestic dependent nations, and then creating the trust responsibilities. All of this to really say that federal jurisdiction supersedes, overrides any tribal jurisdiction. And then you can see just some of the other things that I put there with regards to land for sale. There's a picture of Crow Dog. Crow Dog's important because in 1871, that's when the United States said, look, we're going to get involved in tribal matters, when before 1871, tribes dealt with tribal matters internally, but his basically gave birth to federal oversight under federal criminal jurisdiction called the Major Crimes Act of 1871. And it was his case that was the genesis of that. So going to the 1920s, we have the Snyder Act, Public Law 68-175. It was an act to authorize the Secretary of Interior to issue certificates of citizenship to Native Indians, Native tribes. And then while the tribes were ratified in the US constitutions, tribes were still not US citizens. And while the 14th Amendment in 1868 granted citizenship to African Americans, it did not give, through interpretation, any citizenship to Native or Indigenous people, and folks during that time said it didn't apply to tribes. It was not until 1924 that tribes finally grant citizenships to tribes, but the privileges of that citizenship were left to the states, and that's where we still had issues related to suppression of votes from the states themselves. So the Indian Citizenship Act and the right to vote. Although Congress passed the act in 1924, tribal members and new citizens living on reservations continue to be excluded from the democratic franchise. New Mexico and Arizona tribes successfully litigated their rights to vote in 1948. Utah and North Dakota became the last states to afford on-reservation tribes the right to vote in 1957 and 58, respectively. So one of the takeaways was that tribes, including my grandfather, who was a code talker, were fighting to protect our country during World War II, but their own states, like Arizona, did not grant them the right to vote. And so tribes were fighting this, serving as members of our armed forces and participating to support our country as citizens should do. And still, we had this suppression, disenfranchisement by states and state governments. So these suppression laws kept tribes from voting and seeking elected office through things like poll taxes and language tests. In Arizona, for example, tribes could not fully participate in voting until 1970 when the Supreme Court upheld a ban against using literacy tests. So there was a case that talked about that. So this next slide talks about voting back then and then now voting. So voting back then, starting as early as 1948, we had our grandparents, our great grandparents participating in elections. And so the upper left shows a group of tribal members voting at a location. Throughout Indian country, we had members who were assimilating into the dominant society and participating. And you can see that in the lower right corner, black and white, of them now not wearing traditional dress, becoming kind of this, picket fence, urban sedentary life, and kind of living this lifestyle. And yet tribes were still not allowed to vote. But now we see all kinds of color, and we see all kinds of activities. We see folks running for office. We see supporting federal campaigns, national campaigns, state and tribal, as well as local and county elections. So tribes are definitely involved in every facet of the election process and franchise. So even with the voting activity that's occurring, there are still barriers in Indian country. So tribes still have their native languages. So there's, in some cases, limited English language or difficulty understanding the ballot. So interpreters are still a need when it comes to especially elders and voters who need help in translating kind of the ballot themselves. There are voter ID laws. Real voting locations also are few and far between. Tribes, like many unlike rural areas, reservations have non-traditional addresses. In many cases, don't have address locations, instead use PO boxes. So that's a barrier. In my own race in 2008, I fought that issue running for the Arizona House of Representatives. And simply, in my case, we had a challenger basically said I was not a legitimate candidate and my signatures don't count because those that signed my petitions were not allowed because there was a problem with the address requirement. They were saying a mailing address did not qualify candidates under then that law, and that I needed basically a physical address. Well, if you travel to Navajo, there is no mailman coming to your street because there are no streets. And so the non-traditional address system is still an issue. Fortunately, when I got into the Arizona House, myself and another native legislator from our region were able to put a solution together, and we got a law passed that now said, look, with an ID, with some of the existing provisions in protecting our voting franchise, we can now utilize mailing addresses for folks who are nominating candidates to run for office. There's also an issue regarding communications. Broadband and internet access are unavailable often to vote or register folks online. So that's a big problem. And that's just a function of the infrastructure, with tribes being remote, end of the line communities, and often uh, um, at regions where there is no coverage when it comes to communication. There are also restrictions on the hours, days, and places that people can register and vote. Um, I come from the western part of the Navajo Nation, and between communities, we are about 45 minutes to an hour from each of these communities. So if, for example, we're on one side of our community, it takes almost an hour to get there to find the closest poll site location. And then what happens, and what used to happen, is states would put a poll location on one side of a community, town, and maybe even in greater distance, and then have a tribal voting locations in a separate area. So what our nation has done is co-located tribal elections with federal and state elections, so that when folks vote at a state location, and either way, a tribal location, they pass from one side of the building, go around, and then vote in the other side. So now we have co-located polls, and so that tribal leaders can, or tribal citizens can participate, as opposed to picking and choosing if they're going to vote in one election or another, because of the separation of the location. And then, of course, just like anywhere in Arizona and other states that are suppressing laws, there are removal of eligible voters from lists of registered voters. Is a big problem. Tribes are economically depressed in a lot of ways, and so we have a lot of folks moving from reservations to urban centers, and living there for a cycle in terms of work, a year, 2 years, maybe even four. Same thing with college natives who are leaving the reservation to go to schools. And because of change of addresses and other challenges, they get removed from voting roles. My case, for example, I am still a voter in my home community with the tribe, but I live and I have a home which is in Coconino County. I have a home in Apache County. Sometimes we find out that we've been removed from either one. And so we have to have a process that says, look, even though I'm registered with the tribe in my home community, that shouldn't preclude me from voting at Apache County, where my home is, and that's where my state residence is. So there's a lot of voting challenges and barriers that we still deal with in Indian country. I've provided a link so folks can take a look a little more at some of these issues in detail. Now, when it comes to the right to vote, tribes have the right to vote, and it applies to tribal voters. We know this because we use the same law as everybody else in this country. Section 1 of the 15th Amendment provides that voters shall not be denied the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. So this was as a result of the Civil War and all that. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act also says was passed to enforce the provisions of the 15th Amendment. So while we have other communities of colors, minorities that are protected by then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we of course all know that that was gutted in 2013 by the Supreme Court. So you can see that the picture here where the Voting Rights Act applies, and it's largely in the South, but good old Arizona is right there with them because of discriminatory voting practices that are subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And I said many times that if it weren't for the South being the South having the highest density of voting discriminatory practice, the second place where we would find all the discrimination would be on the Navajo Nation in Apache County in Arizona. And it's Apache, Navajo, and to some extent Coconino County. Why? Because there are tribes in those counties. There are Navajos in particular that are in the Navajo and Apache counties, and there are folks like my grandmother who was alive in 1977 who tried to vote and was told that she had to read and provide a provision, answer questions related to the U.S. Constitution to be able to vote in an election in Apache County. My mother reminds me of that. She could not do it. My mother went to high school, was able to read it. My grandmother never went to high school, was unable to go to the grade school, and only spoke Navajo. So she couldn't do it, but she had the right to vote, but that was still happening as late as the late 1970s. And so we need Section 1 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act as it relates to what Congress is looking at right now. And we all know that we have a senator that needs reminding that some of this stuff needs to be taken care of because it impacts directly my people today. So Section 5 and underrepresentation in Arizona. Since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Arizona was subject to the pre-clearance requirements under Section 5, and there's a case that I cited there for you. Because tribes could not vote in Arizona until literary tests were banned by the Voting Rights Act amendments of 1970. Arizona had a serious problem of deficient voter registration among tribal members. And so this is in a case, this is fact, this is something you can read. And the Voting Rights Act says that a state must demonstrate that a proposed voting change does not have a purpose and will not have the effect of discriminating based on race or color. And even if the jurisdiction is not required to comply with Section 5, the jurisdiction must still comply with the 15th Amendment, which I cited earlier, which means we have the right to vote. We are citizens of the United States. Tribes have the right to vote like anybody else. And so that's the purpose of all this information. Now, 21st century, I mentioned barriers before, but in the 21st century, there is still suppression within Indian country. 2004, Arizona voter IDs adversely affected Native voters. 2008, the Navajo Nation were challenged because of their rural and tribal addresses when nominating their elected representative. That is my case, that is my issue. That is something we had to fight to preserve. And what I always think about from 2008 is how many qualified Native candidates all the way up until 2008 were disenfranchised, were removed from the ability to run for office because the tactic was, let's challenge the Native vote and eliminate and therefore disqualify not only the signatures, but the candidate from running against, within an election. I just like to think that that tactic ran it into a brick wall when a Marine, lawyer, and somebody who's hard-headed as myself just said, no way in hell am I going to let this happen. And we went to court for that. And so that was in 2008. And I'm thankful because the party recognized that and also helped me defend and change that. So we were able to do some good there. 2016, tribal voters are still traveling over 100 miles, some by horseback, to get to early voting locations. These tribes are like Kaibab Paiute, Pasquayaki, the Mandan Hidatsa, Arikara, which is up in North Dakota, and other places throughout Indian country. 2018, voter ID laws requiring residential addresses went into effect in North Dakota. So what happened to Arizona in 2008 resurfaced in 2018 in North Dakota because of the use of the PO boxes as residential address. So our adversaries, those who want to suppress, they have conferences every year, and we know that they pass a template back and forth. And I'm sure they had figured out that in 2008, it went down in Arizona. Let's kind of recycle that template and see if we can make it happen somewhere else, like North Dakota with the North Dakota tribes. And so it's still out there. And we know this template use is still being used because in 2020, now in 2002, with every current legislature, we have organizations that are working hard to suppress votes using templates throughout the respective state legislatures. And so again, it's a shout out to our representatives that were elected, that we trusted to do the right thing and pass voter protection laws that will help not only non-tribal voters, but tribal voters in the 21st century. I cannot believe that we're still dealing with a lot of this nonsense in the 21st century. And then lastly, redistricting in 2020 is an issue that adversely affects tribal nations throughout Indian country. We can look in Arizona specifically at the new Arizona congressional district of, what is it, AZ2, Representative Blackman, and his laws that are now attacking what I think a disproportionate impact of tribal voters. And it's all just politics, because you win that district if you suppress the native vote, in particular the Navajo vote, and eliminate that concern so you can win the rest of the county. And it's just disingenuous, it's un-American, and frankly, I think it's cowardly. So, and that's redistricting. So we need folks to stay vigilant, stay ready in protecting against that. Now, fighting back with regards to our future. So Congress introduced the Voting Rights Act of 2019 to remove voting barriers, improve access voting for Native Americans and Alaska Native voters. So that is in Congress. Tribal communities in the country throughout the United States is working to get that passed. It needs advocates and support, and we need allies. So I always tell folks, you need to educate them all, and you need to bring in people that you never thought would be an ally. So if folks are carrying the fight, just kind of add this to your list and make an extra visit or two with regards to the Voting Rights Act for Native Americans. We are also organizing Native American voting protection groups. So our group, Battleground Indian Country, is one of them. There is Native Vote, there is Native American Voting Coalition, and there are regional intertribal efforts throughout a number of states that have tribal communities working to organize Native voting protection. I would say it's not in here, but the parties themselves need to do better internally to address and work with tribal communities and voting. A simple example is we in Battleground Indian Country looked at tribes that had, we felt like a margin we could affect a vote up to 1, maybe 2% of the vote of folks in a particular voting demographic. And we chose these states. We initially overlooked urban areas, and we discovered that in a state like Ohio, where there are no federally recognized tribes, and therefore we wouldn't give it a consideration for Battleground Indian Country, that Ohio has urban centers filled with Native citizens. Remember, during the 50s, the government tried to remove and sent young Native students all over the country to urban centers to assimilate them, to kind of start, to bring them into the fold, as it were. And we learned that in Ohio, population centers in Columbus, Dayton, and Cleveland were large numbers of Natives. And so in this effort, we know that we need to go there, organize there, but we also know that maybe the state parties that are working in Ohio and the national efforts that are working in Ohio should work with us, organize, so that we can now go specifically and target the Native voters in these urban areas that could impact several elections or key elections. So that's how we're getting smart, and we're looking to reach and build allies throughout Indian country. Third one, recruit and elect Native American candidates to every office, whether locally, county, state, and federal. We have tremendous opportunities with qualified Native candidates that are running. And so they're always there. Look for them. If you have any questions, you can call us and we can point you to some of the qualified natives that are running for office. And we need resources. We need our allies and friends, our supporters, to invest in Native American nonprofits dedicated to protecting Native American rights to vote and participate in U.S. elections. So all of that are our efforts really on a large scale to fight back and protect our future with regards to our health and welfare, our general welfare. Now let's go to 2020, Battleground Indian Country. We all saw the headlines. Arizona flipped, but within Arizona, there were articles that said, look, the Navajo Nation helped flip Arizona for the Democrats. And so there's a site there. There were a number of groups, including this woman up here, who went and actually led the effort to help bring in voters from long ranges on horseback. I told you that Battleground Country, through a friend and colleague of mine, led the phone banking to call numbers throughout the Navajo Nation to turn out the vote. So the net result of that was that we were able to flip Arizona for during the 2020 election. The states that we also had activities and workers in was Nevada, so we protected Nevada. We had folks in Iowa. As you can see, that didn't go too well because it stayed red. And then we had Battleground Indian Country group working in North Carolina. They just didn't have enough firepower, and that state stayed barely red. We were hoping for a different outcome, but we learned a lot. We know that we have urban efforts, and we also know that we may need to guard in the Rust Belt states with tribes in the Great Lakes. But we also know, like Ohio, there are urban centers that have tribal populations that nobody even thought of. And so we're going to work towards that. This brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. This is the word for thank you in Navajo. It's pronounced ahiahet. And there is my contact. You can see that our culture is rich with color, life, and diversity. We're there because it is part of our way of life. And we work to protect our votes. And so we're happy to be here. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to give a little bit of insight in respect to tribal voters and our right to vote.